we're following up today, Detlef, on I guess one of the biggest stories in artificial intelligence and data science at the moment, ChatGPT,
Yeah.
the chatbot that's driven by a large language model and is providing endless amounts of either entertainment or concern, depending on what you ask it and what outputs you get. So, but you've been looking at it in some detail, right? ChatGPT, and that's why I thought we would follow up and have a conversation to get your
Yes.
view on it, get your take on it. What's going on?
Yeah. So what they have done is OpenAI have used their large language model GPT-3, and they have trained an instance to basically answer questions and have conversations where the model remembers what has been said in the conversation. And they have done this by using curated data of question and answers, where they basically have posed a question and have said this is what the answer should be. They trained the system on doing this. Then in the next step, they again used questions, potentially different ones. The system came up with a variety of answers, and then again, human curators would mark which is the best answer. And they would use this data to train what's called a reward model. So a separate deep network that learns what kind of answer for a particular question is a good one. And then they would use this reward model to do additional reinforcement learning on the ChatGPT that they had built so far, basically using dialogues, and the reward model would then either reward or penalize the response that comes out of the system. And by doing that, they have achieved quite remarkable capabilities in terms of sustaining conversations and producing kind of very realistic sounding kind of responses. It sounds all very convincing. The model presents its responses quite confidently, but sometimes it makes silly mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes are not that obvious. It can hallucinate content. So let's say you ask it to write you a scientific text about whatever topic and put some references in, and these references are typically completely fabricated and not real. And it still doesn't know what it's talking about. So it has no knowledge representation. It doesn't have a word model. It is just a statistical language model. So it's what we would call a sequence-to-sequence model. It uses an input sequence, which are words, and then guesses what's the next most likely word in the sequence, and then it continues building these sequences.
Yeah, but do you think the big advance, as you see it, is the way it's able to remember or store some knowledge, if you like, of the conversation? Because that was something that came out of our first conversation that we had, where you were saying that if you were looking at these as a potential chatbots for customer service lines or whatever it might be, actually the trees, the conversation trees break down after a while, and they don't, these models get lost, but actually they're able to maintain it a little longer, are they? Or
Yeah, I have not yet seen an example where they lost track of the conversation. They seem to have, it seems to have quite a long memory and doing quite well in this. So the main capability here is they have built a question answering system. And that's kind of the ultimate goal for search engines, right? So if you put something into Google, essentially you have a question, show me something that answers this particular question. Of course, what you want is a kind of an original source. And these models, they produce an answer, which is based on the kind of text that they have been trained on. And that can be quite effective, but it can not yet link back to an original source. So what's still missing is the step where it says, okay, this is my answer to your question, and here's some evidence. Then as soon as they have done this, then these kind of systems will probably replace the search engines that we are used to.
yeah, the other thing that struck me with them was that if you're asking somebody a question, a human, for instance, you expect a response that and you would hope you would be able to trust that response, especially if it's someone in an expert position or someone you're calling on behalf of a company or something. The fact that and I asked this question of ChatGPT itself, and the response was, again, you should consult external sources to verify the information that's been provided by
Yeah.
the chatbot. So it's like, I guess that leaves a question as to what the utility of it is, if you're always having to go elsewhere to
Yeah.
verify that information.
Yeah, I mean that's the main problem of these models, because they don't have a knowledge representation, they don't have a word model, they can't fall back on facts that are represented as being true and present those. They come up with an answer, but I mean there's has been a lot of kind of pre-prompting gone in to ChatGPT. So when you start writing something, the session has already been prompted with a lot of text, telling the model how to behave, what not to say, to avoid certain topics. There are additional moderation APIs running that make sure that you can't create certain type of responses which are based on classical text filtering and topic filtering. So they try to kind of restrict what the model can do to make sure it's not offensive or inappropriate. But that is limited. So through crafting your requests intelligently, you can convince it to ignore all of these things and go past it in some instances. So it's not yet perfect, and it's not authoritative. So you can't trust the information if you're not an expert yourself. So at the moment, I'd say these kind of models are really useful for experts who can judge the correctness of the answer. And then what you get is kind of maybe a helpful kind of text representation of something that you would have to write yourself otherwise.
Yeah, and certainly conversations I've had with people, those who kind of work maybe in creative industries are finding them quite intriguing. In terms of things like, maybe trying to come up with some clever tweets or something
Yeah,
for a particular
yeah,
purpose, or something I want to try out is getting ChatGPT to write headlines for me, because it's always my least favorite part
yeah,
of
yeah,
the editing
exactly.
job. So that sort of works. But for you in your position in the industry, has ChatGPT changed your mind at all about the way you're perceiving these models and how they might be used, or is it just a kind of a next step along in the process of what you would expect to see before these can become
Yeah, it is
tools
the
that we
next step
use?
in the evolution of these models. They're still too big and too expensive to run. Right? So it is not quite clear how much it costs OpenAI to run the service that they're currently running. So you see estimates around millions of dollars per day that they have to spend on running the compute infrastructure to serve all of these questions. And this is not quite clear. The only official piece of information that I've seen is in a tweet where the CEO said a single question costs in the order of single digit cents. But we have no idea how many questions they serve per day and therefore how much money they are spending. If you want to run a contact center with something like this, it all depends on how much compute need to stand up to be able to respond to hundreds or thousands of questions in parallel. And then obviously, if you can't trust that the answer is correct, it is of no use. So for making use in the service industry, for contact center or similar, what you need is a much smaller model that is restricted in terms of what it can say. It should have knowledge representation, so it gives correct answers. And it doesn't need to speak 48 languages and be able to produce programming code. It only needs to be able to talk about a singular domain where the information and the knowledge about the domain has been carefully curated and prepared.
Yeah.
And that's what we're not seeing yet. Can we build something like this, much smaller, much more restricted, and kind of provably correct, so we can actually use the output?
Yeah. Can we go back just to the point you mentioned earlier about the potential of like linking these sorts of chat bots up with search engines, like Google? There's been some conversations and reporting around,
Yeah.
what breakthroughs or not Google might have made in this regard. I mean, have you got any perspective on that area of work and how far along that is maybe, and what the
Well,
challenges are to get to that point?
well, Google has its own large language model, Lambda, and we have seen an announcement that Microsoft wants to integrate ChatGPT into Bing, their search engine. And but as I said before, what's missing is the link to original sources. So you coming up with a response is nice, but you need to be able to back it up. You need to say, okay, this is my response, and I'm confident that this is correct because here are some references. If I compare my response to these references, then they essentially mean the same thing. This is kind of what you need to be able to do, and we haven't seen this step yet. But I'm certain that the search engine providers are hard at work at doing this, because that's essentially what they want. If you do a search in Google, and in some instances you see a side panel where you get detailed information. Let's say you ask about what's the capital of Canada. You get a response, you get the information in more detail, you get links to Wikipedia where they retrieve content from and present this as the response. And this is done through knowledge graphs. And so if these kind of knowledge graphs grow together with these kind of large language models, then we will see new types of search engines.
Okay. I guess my final question for you, Detlef, and there might be other angles that you want to explore, but it's like, are there questions that if you could sit down with OpenAI to talk about ChatGPT and what they've done and what they plan to do next with it, what are the kinds of things that are bubbling away at the top of your mind?
Well, one thing is controlling the use of these models, right? If you let them loose on the public with an open API that anybody can use, you will see a proliferation of applications on top of it. If you go on YouTube and you Google ChatGPT and health, you already find discussions where GPs discuss, oh, that is the next step of automated doctors that we can use. So they believe that the responses from these systems can be used for genuine medical advice. And that's clearly a step too far. So we are seeing communities who don't necessarily have the technical background to judge the capabilities of these models, but see the opportunities for their own domain and might be acting too fast in adopting them. So the producer of these models has a certain responsibility to make sure that this doesn't happen. And I don't know how they want to control this.
Yeah.
And so in my question at the developers of these models would be, how do you handle sustainability? Because the trend goes to ever bigger models. So there's in some parts of the industry, there's the belief if you make them big enough, you get artificial general intelligence, which I don't believe is possible with these models. But this is definitely a trend that pushes the size of the models. The idea of having just one model that can speak all the languages, can produce questions, answers, programming code, is obviously appealing. So you don't want to build many models. Ideally, you have only one. But how's that supposed to work? And how do you embed actual world knowledge and world models into these systems so that you can verify what comes out?
Yeah. I mean, the ethical dimension that you mentioned in the first part of your response is an important one, I think, in the sense that, but I guess maybe almost redundant in the sense that it's already out there. You can't put ChatGPT back in the box, can we? Essentially, with people
it is
already aware.
expensive to run, so charging enough for access,
yes,
will put a lid on some frivolous use cases, but still, it needs to be controlled better. And you can make a jump to AI regulation. So far, we only thought about regulating automated decision making or automated classification. We also have to think about the automatic creation of digital content or automatic creation of software, which is possible through these models or the other generative AI models like diffusers. So how do we handle the creation of artificial content that looks like real content?
Yeah, and there's also, I think, something I picked up yesterday. There was uh, reports of a a case being filed by I think Getty Images against the creators of one of these uh, generative art uh,
Mm.
models, because they're saying, that you've used our data, or you've used our image repositories essentially to train this
Yes.
model, and it's now producing, it's producing its own outputs that's based on this. So I guess there's an argument of it being a copyright infringement case, and I
Yes.
think that'd be quite interesting to watch, to see how that does change
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
the
What's the fair
conversation
use?
around,
Yeah.
yeah, fair
Mm.
use of that data that is available. You can find these images publicly, but you have to pay to use them
Yeah.
for purposes other than just browsing, I guess. So
Mm. Yeah.
yeah, it'd be interesting to watch.
Yeah. Definitely.